Yes, thank you very much for this very clear talk. I have two questions. First, I was wondering what job the transition exactly does, and how this is related to the other contexts where Kant speaks about the transition, for example, in the preface to the Critic of Judgment, or in the unpublished work to the Metaphysics of Morals, or most famously in the Opus Posthumum, when it speaks about the transition from the metaphysics of science to the exact sciences, and how this is related to you interpret the transition here, because at the beginning you seem to suggest that it is a kind of overcoming what was said before. In all these other contexts, Kant seems to speak about how they are linked with each other, connected with each other. This seemed to raise a further question, the Eckhart-Förster question, for example, if the unity of reason seems to imply one principle, and how this idea of one principle relates to the Kantian distinction of all these different fields of how reason, for example, is applied. And the second question would be, if you have any idea who the skeptics were, because maybe it's just a funny incident. If you look at the situation in the end of the 18th century, there were the Göttinger Popularphilosophen. They were called like that. And they were, for example, Feder and Garve. Christian Garve was one of the members of the Göttinger Popularphilosophy. And they had this strange idea that one could link or relate Stoicism with Lockean ideas. So.
Well, to address your first question, I wouldn't necessarily want to claim that Kant's use of transition is unified or identical across all of his works. But it is interesting that he speaks of a transition in the first critique to the transcendental deduction of the categories. And he uses a kind of a skeptical problem to motivate this transition. It's when he speaks of the concept of causality and how that concept may in fact be empty. Or I think, as he puts it, what may be given to us in sensibility may not have a necessary relation to the functions of the understanding. So there's this problem of a kind of a dualism of the faculties, a kind of an internal chaos that Kant uses to motivate the transition, Übergang, to the transcendental deduction. So I think that use is consistent to what I'm claiming is going on in the groundwork, where each of these transitions revolve around some kind of problematic. So it is, I think, in the groundwork at least, and maybe in other places, a transition in the sense of an overcoming. That's not to say that each of the transitions are identical. I mean, maybe one that stands out is the transition in section 1 from common human reason to philosophical reason. It seems as though that's a kind of an internal movement, an internal transition, because Kant is simply trying to clarify or make explicit a principle that he thinks is implicit and operative within common human understanding. Of course, in section 2, the Übergang concerns a shift of philosophical methods from the popular method to the unpopular method, Kant's own metaphysics of morals. So just to sum up my first reply then, I wouldn't necessarily say that transition has a uniform meaning in all of Kant's works, but it is interesting that in many of his works, and especially in the groundwork, it does seem to be a strategy that he uses for overcoming certain limitations that are found within particular frameworks or points of view. The idea that if we remain within the framework of popular moral philosophy, we're soon going to run up against this obstacle that necessitates a transition for a new kind of philosophical method. In response to your second question, who are these skeptics? And did you mean the skeptics that Kant introduces at the beginning of Groundwork 2? Right. I mean, it seems like the popular moral philosophers were definitely the object of Kant's critique in this work. But the idea that I want to entertain here is that Kant is not so much preoccupied with addressing historical skeptics in the groundwork. So he's interested, I mean, this kind of connects up to some of the talks yesterday, that I don't think that Kant is so much preoccupied with thinking of skeptics as actual persons, but he's interested more in skeptical paradoxes that are possible, even if there hasn't been some actual person to articulate that skeptical possibility. So, at least what I'm claiming here is that the skeptical method that seems to be implicit within this text, it could be addressing actual historical skeptics. But what's sort of intriguing about it is that it could also be used to unearth sources of doubt that maybe have not been articulated and defended by some actual person. And that's where the passage from the first critique, I think, is illuminating, because Kant says, to take up the skeptical method sometimes requires us to take up the position of a skeptic in order to think up doubts that maybe no one else has really thought before, in order to bring things to the highest degree of uncertainty in order to find the trail of truth. So I'm not completely denying that there is a historical context here, and that he could be thinking of especially the popular philosophers of his time. But I wouldn't say that that is his only object of criticism here in this work. So that's how I would answer your second concern.
Thanks for very interesting and nice talk. It was very rich as well, so I'm only going to pick out a couple of issues from it. I had one question that really just asking for clarification of how you're reading the text. I mean, the problem that's residual at the end of the second section about autonomy being required for morality, but there's still being a worry that it might be an illusion. That problem could be understood in at least two different ways. It's a weaker way and a stronger way. I mean, the weaker way would be something like, well, we've shown that we need non-inclinational grounds for acting in order to have morality. If it's just inclination, it's pathological, it's happiness-oriented, and so on and so forth, we need something more than that. So autonomy in that sense. We can act out of respect for the moral law, whatever it is. But of course, Kant's also interested in autonomy in a much stronger sense than that as well. That would be completely compatible, logically speaking, what I just described as autonomy, with our being causally determined to act the way we do. So I have respect for the moral law, act out of it. I'm not acting out of inclinations or for my own happiness, but I'm causally determined to do that, right? So, and Kant obviously is very interested in also establishing spontaneity, what we call spontaneity as a foundation for morality, and thinks you can't have morality without that. So it sounded as though the way you were reading the third section, you were mainly talking about the first kind of autonomy. The possibility and indeed the fundamentalness to the will of a sort of motivation that is not inclination-based or motivated by happiness or whatnot. It's a self-given law and so on. But you could give yourself something, insofar as you can do that at all, and be causally determined to do it. So there's still that further question. That's a question for clarification. The bigger thing that's on my mind, though, really, and perhaps there just is no good answer to this, but you started out very helpfully, I think, talking about the role of skepticism in general in Kant and the different types of skepticism that he addresses in his theoretical philosophy, for example. And among those types is, of course, skepticism in the proper sense, or what ought to be the proper sense, the Pyrrhonian skepticism, equipolar skepticism. And he was obsessed with this problem in some form from the mid-1760s at the latest on, and it's still there in the first critique. It's the basis of the antinomies, and so on and so forth. And so now when you think about what that type of skepticism really looked like, moral versions of it were the paradigms, if anything. They were absolutely central to it. So, the last of the 10 tropes of Nicodemus is all about moral conflicts between cultures and so on and so forth. And Montaigne was up to his neck in that as well, in Of Cannibals and the Apology for Raymond Sebond and so on. And yet this type of worry is very difficult to find in Kant. And, one might say that this is one of the, even say that this is one of the enormously disappointing things about Kant's moral philosophy, that he has this extremely narrow, dogmatic conception of what morality is. This very implausible claim that everybody's implicitly committed to it. And that the real problems of morality, problems that other philosophers like Montaigne, like the ancient skeptics, like Nietzsche, like many others have been worried about, these skeptical problems of different moral systems and so on, are just kind of bracketed out. So I wonder if you have anything to say about that that might be helpful.
So just to say a few things about your first question, I think the text is open to these two different interpretive possibilities that you gestured at. So the idea that at the end of Groundwork 2, Kant has articulated a certain conception of autonomy in terms of self-legislation that hasn't ruled out the possibility that we might be causally determined. And that would be one way of understanding the transition to section 3 of the groundwork, to give us an account of our spontaneity that is pure, so that rules out any sort of empirically conditioned basis of action. And I think that's a plausible reading. I'm interested in an alternative reading, which is to say that the conception of autonomy that Kant is introducing in Groundwork 2 is a very strong and robust one. But it's one that really only applies at that point in the argument to rational beings in general. And so that's why there's the need for section 3 to show via a deduction how such a pure conception of autonomy, which is conceptually inconsistent with causal determination, how that could apply to beings like us who possess not only reason but also sensibility. So see, that's a different. There are two plausible ways of reading the transition from section 2 and 3. I think the text lends itself to both readings, but the one that maybe I was relying upon implicitly here was the second one, the idea that we do get a strong conception of autonomy in Groundwork 2. And the question is then, well, how does this apply to us? In response to your second question, I guess it is this sort of puzzle why Kant does not take up Pyrrhonian worries explicitly in his moral philosophy. And I guess what I'm trying to suggest here is that what's central, at least in this work, is what he calls this natural dialectic, which is not quite a Pyrrhonian worry, but it is a dialectic that Kant thinks we suffer from pre-theoretically. And I think there are reasons why he emphasizes this particular problem in this work. I think it's part of his project of giving a groundwork for a future metaphysics of morals. So my claim here that Kant is focused primarily on a practical conflict that he thinks afflicts us in our everyday attitudes. I think it makes sense given the genre of this text, insofar as he's trying to clear the foundations for a future metaphysics of morals, which will be a system of normative principles that will have real-life application. So that's why I read the groundwork as part of sort of the tradition of moral philosophy classically understood. But in order to prepare the way for that system, Kant needs to address issues that aren't necessarily of a philosophical speculative nature. They're sort of practical problems. And then I think that relates to this kind of obsession he has to criticize popular moral philosophy, because its method is flawed. So if we can articulate the right method of doing moral philosophy, we're on our way to diagnosing certain kinds of practical conflicts that arise between duty and happiness. Of course, that's not to alleviate these concerns that you mentioned, which are that Kant leaves us with an overly narrow conception of what morality is. And it seems to be that Kant is framing our only sorts of conflicts between inclination and duty. I think there are ways in which you can alleviate those worries by providing a richer account of what self-love is for Kant. I don't think it's necessarily just a preoccupation with one's own inclinations, narrowly construed. I think there is a way in which you can read Kant's writings, say in The Religion, where he talks about our standing in relation to others and our social influences as still being bound up with a kind of self-love, except it's not physical desires that we're trying to satisfy, but social desires. So maybe a richer account of self-love is one way of addressing these concerns that the picture that Kant is leaving us with is overly narrow and stark. But I guess I don't quite have an answer to this question of why Kant does not take up explicitly Pyrrhonian concerns in his moral writings when he does so at length in his theoretical writings. So I don't know. It's a puzzle.
Just trying to think along the same somewhat charitable lines, perhaps. It does look as though what he's committed to doing is saying, well, yeah, there is all this variety in moral expressions, let's say, across cultures, across times. But if you look more closely, you're going to find a lot of self-love buried in it, and it's not really moral, it's pathological, and so on and so forth. And perhaps the more important point to mention there might be, though, that he had a predecessor in this area who had something like this sort of project of explaining away apparent diversity in the value sphere. And as a predecessor he thought very highly of, namely Hume. So, 1766, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, he's pretty much a Humean on moral philosophy. Quite sharply contrary to his mature moral philosophy. He's a sentimentalist, a Humean sentimentalist. And Hume, of the Standard of Taste, had precisely taken on the job of conceding to, Pyrrhonians and the rest of them, that there's this huge variety in moral life and so on. And then trying to argue that beneath the appearance of tremendous diversities, there's actually unity. There's this wonderful metaphor in the second inquiry about, the Rhone and the Rhine having a common source, but then looking very different because of the different ground over which they flow. And Hume then had, very sophisticated strategies. In the end, it's completely, unsuccessful. But it's really very sophisticatedly unsuccessul. The attempt to explain away this diversity. And so Kant would be doing, on your reading, be doing something a little bit like that with this. Yeah,
I think so. So just add one quick follow-up. I think that's extremely helpful, and it also, in an interesting way, sheds different light on the nature of Kant's intellectual development from the 1760s to the 1780s, because it shows that there's a kind of a unity in his methodological commitments in trying to find unity in the diversity of moral life. I think that's the project that's informing his sort of quasi-sentimentalist phase, and it remains consistent when he adopts rationalism. So it's interesting that there's kind of a methodological unity between Kant's so-called sentimentalist phases from the 1760s and his later full-blown rationalism. There's a common project, and I think that's often overlooked because on the face of it, it looks like there's this sharp turn towards rationalism. But I think the deeper commitments remained more or less the same throughout those periods.
Okay, there's 3 more people with questions on my list.
So I was very interested in your, I thought it was a terrific paper. And I was particularly interested in your reading of the deduction in the third section as parallel to the transcendental deduction of the categories. And in the light of that parallel, I started to wonder whether there might be another parallel between the general question that you're addressing about the relation of the groundwork to moral skepticism, and a question that often gets asked about the relation of the first critique to epistemological skepticism. So, at any rate, there used to be quite a bit of debate about whether you could see the argument of the first critique as directed against skeptics who question the very possibility of objective knowledge, or whether it has a narrower focus of assuming the possibility of objective knowledge, but then from within that framework, asking a more specific kind of question that might also count as a skeptical question about synthetic a priori knowledge or the pure concepts.
Yes, that's sort of the short version of my answer. So I think that's a very helpful parallel. And it's interesting that in the first critique literature, there are sort of in these two phases. First, people were reading the transcendental deduction as a kind of an ambitious anti-skeptical argument that wasn't presupposing the possibility of objective knowledge. And on the basis of very thin premises, was attempting to arrive at some conclusion that would undermine the skeptic's position. And then the second phase of first critique scholarship has been these more sort of modest readings where Kant is taking up more of a regressive method where he's presuming the possibility of objective knowledge and then trying to, in a sense, uncover the conditions of possibility that make that intelligible. And I think sort of what I'm trying to do in Kant's moral writings is bring a similarly modest framework to the table. Because I think what Kant is trying to do in section 3 of the groundwork, it's easily obscured if people expect an ambitious anti-skeptical argument. And I think there's this common way to misread the text as providing a strict deduction of the moral law. And I think there's ways in which you can defend an alternative reading, which is to say that Kant is sort of already working within certain moral presuppositions and trying to make intelligible their conditions of possibility. So the very question, how is a moral imperative, a categorical imperative possible, is a different kind of question. I think it's one that belongs more to this modest approach, not necessarily trying to refute the skeptic, but trying to render intelligible within our own point of view certain aspects of our moral experience. The fact that we experience moral claims as imperatives, as binding us. How is that possible? And I think Kant's method of providing a deduction in his sort of juridical sense of the term is his method for answering that. So I think, yes, there is a parallel between certain ways you can give a modest interpretation of the transcendental deduction, and I would very much like to extend that style of interpretation into Kant's moral writings as well. So that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. My first question is a version of Michael's question, but with a slightly different direction, and then I take it from there to my second question. So the first question is again about equipollence. If I recall correctly, in the first critique, Kant uses the term the skeptical method only in order to refer to equipollent skepticism. I think the term, he introduces it right in the Transcendental Dialectics and has a very specific, attaches a very specific meaning to it. So when you know, the words skeptical method as used by Kant seem to refer to something highly specific, which doesn't mean that there's not another issue going on, exactly the issue that you're describing, that deserves to be called skepticism because it's an engagement with what we would call skeptical paradoxes. So so the first question is really just a question about that. So does Kant have, as the quote from the lecture suggests, which I didn't have in mind, so does he have a broad understanding of skeptical method? Or doesn't he think that other adversarial stances that he occupies have an enemy, that lies within ourselves, who's not the skeptic, but say the idealist or the Epicurean, etc. And we would not ordinarily call them skeptics. Or maybe, so that's just, maybe that's just a question of terminology. And the second question, it seems in your reading, which I find quite interesting, precisely because you map the groundwork onto the transcendental deduction in the first critique, that Kant has the strategy, this is a compatibilism question, the strategy of adding a third player. Like in the first critique, there are three players. So there's understanding, sensibility, and then worries. And here we have will, inclinations, and then worries. And so if he can show that, if I understand you correctly, if he can show that the concept of will is coherent in the way in which the concept of understanding is coherent, then there's no further, then he might say that, well, inclinations are caused, but the will isn't caused. And given that inclinations and the will are not the same concept, he's now free to go for, to accept a form of compatibilism. Given that it's just meaningless to ask whether the will is caused by inclinations. There's no further causation. Inclinations are caused, but the question whether the will is caused by inclination then becomes meaningless. Mm-hmm. Do I understand you correctly that this might be a strategy that is available? I'm not sure what this would lead, but this would be the middle ground between saying that, then why would anyone then say that the will might also be caused? If you say, well, something's caused, well, here's what's caused. The inclinations. In just the same way, in the theoretical case, you would say, well, here's what's caused, Empfindung. But that doesn't mean that understanding is caused. So adding this third level might be an interesting strategy, if I understand you correctly, that this is even an option. I'm not sure whether this is... And then this would be a direct response to the antinomies. So this would be a response to what he perceives as an official skeptical equivalence problem, but it would never be the moralist versus amoralist. Mm-hmm. Because that's not he doesn't think that this is an equivalence problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I like your proposal. I'm not sure how straightforwardly it maps on to, say, groundwork 3, but I could see how that could work, and it even fits with the part of the reply I tried to give to Michael. This idea that Kant is trying to sort of clear space for a notion of the will that is pure, or a notion of practical reason that has a pure use, that's not conditioned by sensible influences like our desires. And then the question is, well, do we possess such a will? So I think that's where the question of application becomes urgent. And you can read part of the argument of groundwork 3 as an attempt to show on what grounds we are entitled to think of ourselves possessing a will that is pure. But he's already tried to clear space for a notion of the purity of the will that rules out certain forms of causal determination. So I'm not sure how much that addresses your question.
So what I want Kant to say, I'm not sure if he can say this, what I would love him to say is something like this. The very idea that the will, given that we have this notion, so he says, look, here's a concept, the will. And then he argues that we can have this concept for all the reasons that he gives. And the result is that it would be utterly meaningless to think there's an entity, the will, that might or might not be caused. That would just be meaningless. Even though it's a good question whether inclinations are caused, and then he says, well, they are caused, probably. For all I can tell, inclinations are caused.
Right.
But is the will caused? Well, is the number 2 caused? So then this would have this shape.
Right. That maybe could be a way of reading the argument then, because Kant does want to say that when we analyze the concept of a rational being, he says it's unintelligible to think of it as not being its own author, authorizing its own principles. So the idea that there could be an alien cause determining it is ruled out. But that's just part of a conceptual argument. And so it's still within the purview of what Kant would call a metaphysics of morals, where we're just doing conceptual analysis. And then the lingering worry is, well, how does this apply to us? So a method of deduction is then required to legitimate the sense in which we can consider ourselves acting under the idea of freedom. But I think Kant wants to say conceptually we can tie the notion of freedom to that of a rational being and show, like you said, that examine carefully the notion of a will being caused does not even make sense. It's not even coherent. But unfortunately, that cannot be the end of his argument, because that would just be a conceptual argument. In response to your first question, to do with the nature of Pyrrhonian skepticism. What was your question again?
Okay, so doesn't Kant use so would he even say that the problems that you present are skeptical problems?
Yes, I remember.
Rather than, you know,
Yeah. So,
Epicurean problems or Stoic problems or idealist.
So what I want to say is, it's true. When you read the first critique, it's in the transcendental dialectic that the term skeptical method is first introduced, and the context is Pyrrhonian. But when we get to the doctrine of method, he gives us an account of the skeptical method which is much more general and that is not limited to the Pyrrhonian context. So my short answer is I do think there's evidence there that his notion of a skeptical method is much more expansive. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. I'm wondering if you could expand on your understanding of the source of the skeptical doubt that we experience in sort of moral transition. You made a good case that the source is somehow first personal, and drawing on the first critique, but also, of course, in the groundwork. But I'm thinking about the parallel that you were drawing to the transcendental deduction in the first critique, where the source there, I wouldn't want to deny that the source of the skeptical doubt, of our right to the categories is somehow first personal. We have to adopt that position, and just what you were saying now with the doctrine of method, Kant elaborates on the need for us first personally to take on this sort of skeptical position. But the juridical model that he bases the deduction on is, in a certain sense, second personal, or the source of skeptical doubt. Comes from without, through the skeptical challenge that's made, at least in the legal case, to our right to possession. So I'm just wondering if you see maybe broader, nothing, being in tension with the first personal understanding of the source of skeptical doubt, but maybe if there might be some sort of broader or developmental sense we might have of that in the moral case of that source.
No, that's intriguing. I would be tempted to say that Kant wants to characterize these kinds of conflicts that happen at a pre-theoretical level. They're from the first-person perspective. But I think you can then develop the notion of that perspective that perhaps has a kind of a second-person dimension to it. So my thought is simply that it seems like when Kant is introducing the source of this natural dialectic, as he calls it, it has to do with a certain kind of misrepresentation of the nature of moral demands, in which we almost experience them as external to us, given their binding and necessitating character. And it seems like resolving the dialectic, and this is why I have this kind of idiosyncratic reading of the groundwork, where I want to say the deduction of section 3 is actually meant to resolve a practical conflict, the natural dialectic. I think that is less strange when you realize what the results of the deduction amount to is a recognition of the source of moral imperatives. They come from within us. So I think the dialectic was set in motion because, in a sense, we didn't recognize the source of moral imperatives. We took them to be external to us. And the dialectic reaches some kind of resolution when we come to a proper recognition of their origin. So that's why I think the educative dimension of Kant's argument here is in a sense trying to educate our moral self-understanding. And there's a kind of a developmental story, I think, underlying the whole text of the groundwork. We start off experiencing moral demands as alien, and the solution is to reach an understanding of ourselves in which we recognize their source within us. I'm not sure where the second personal dimension fits in there, but I would say that you could, I think, read part of Kant's argument here as trying to, in a sense, work through tensions that arise from the first-person perspective, perhaps to enrich in that perspective. I don't know where the second personal aspect might become relevant there, because it does really sound like a kind of a first-person perspective.
Just quickly to clarify, I wasn't talking about the source of what we come away with having gone through the transition, namely the moral law,
right,
as binding. right? The source will be, if we do it right, will be first personal. But I was asking about the source of the skeptical doubt that gets the transition going, because in the juridical case, in the deduction of the categories, it seems, from what Kant says, the source is not first personal of the doubt itself. The source of the knowledge we get at the end is, of course, first personal. It's a deduction of the categories. But I was just curious, because of the parallel you wanted to draw, and this idea of skepticism certainly being, a doubt that lies within us, but perhaps is a seed that could be planted in different ways, let's say.
Yeah, I'll have to think more about that. I mean, I'm tempted to think that the source of the doubt in the practical sphere is of a first personal character. But I think usually when I have these kinds of conversations, I'm worried that the terms first and second personal are malleable. So maybe there's a way in which I could, I'll have to listen to your talk, and maybe there's a way in which these are compatible views.